Chianti will forever be associated with those pot-bellied fiascos in straw jackets, what Burton Anderson in the book describes as the epitome of rustic elegance. In Verona, you can still find those fiascos of Chianti in the supermarket shelves. What is it that makes it such a resonant and evocative region and wine?
I think maybe it's just the speed at which it's all happened for Chianti. In 70 years, it's changed so much.
Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast. This month, our guest is Susan Keevil. Susan is a former editor of Decanter magazine and the author of The Witch Guide to Wine. Currently a writer and editorial director of the Académie du Vin Library. Before we talk about the book that you've been involved in, the book that you compiled on Tuscany, I want to explore a bit about your personal background, your interest in wine, and your early career as a wine writer. I understand you had an early professional experience as a cellar rat cooling Chardonnays in Australia's Hunter Valley. Now, I can't work out if that was a really exotic sounding introduction to wine or whether being a cellar rat is something a bit more, I don't know. Tell us a bit about that experience.
It wasn't that glamorous, I have to say. And it was not my first job, but I just landed in Australia and it really was wham bam, right in the deep end. I think because I did a geography degree at London University, and part of that degree was a module called the Historical Geography of Viticulture.
Wow.
And for some reason, I think the employers at Rosemount thought that qualified me to make wine. I don't know why. We had two shifts, a day shift and a night shift. And I was on the day shift, fortunately. And Gregoire Bichot was the guy that had my job on the night shift. And he obviously was steeped in Beaune and Burgundy and all of that. And I was just handed a spanner, a large spanner, and said, right, tank number 16 or whatever needs cooling. Can you sort it out? So I had to go and cool this ferment. And they all disappeared for a smoko, and I was left to it. I had no idea what I was doing. So massively thrown in the deep end. But, I've never learned so quickly. Not glamorous at all. I ended up cuts and bruises, running everywhere. They used to call me the greyhound, really skinny and just ran everywhere. Yeah, but I loved it. That was my starting point.
Fantastic. And sometimes being thrown in at the deep end like that is the best way.
Yeah, I guess so. And learning quite so fast. Perhaps it was. I ended up really loving Chardonnay and finding the whole thing absolutely fascinating.
And did you have an interest in wine before that? Had you gone to Australia specifically with?
Yes, I did. I mean, it was sort of in the background as I was growing up. My father he liked wine and not beer, and so it was there. And then obviously when I went to university, alcohol was quite a big presence, and wine came into the geography. And as I say, studying the geography of viticulture and the way the vine has moved around the world as culture does, with the different sort of migrations, the vine went with them, and so that sort of study was good. And then actually getting to know what it tasted like in a broader way was fun as well. So yeah, it was a gradual fascination. And by the time I got back to England after I'd been away for a year, I knew that I wanted to get involved in the wine industry somehow.
Okay.
And so just happened to see, a friend of mine saw a job in The Guardian advertised for Mitchell Beazley, which was for a wine editor. Well, that sounds perfect for me. But I wasn't an editor in any way, shape or form. And so I was really brave and I applied for it. And they said, well, you're not qualified at all, but we really like you. And they took me on. But they took me on as a researcher. So I was a Google, if you like, because, while, in those, now we kind of type our questions into a nice white box on a screen, then we didn't have that. So they sent Susan out on the streets of London to go and photocopy stuff at the British Museum or a library here or there, everywhere. So a lot of trudging around.
Okay, so from that very hands-on experience in Australia to another quite hands-on experience, I suppose, in the world of publishing.
Yeah.
Am I correct in thinking that you worked with Hugh Johnson
Yeah.
on the Pocket Wine Book?
Yeah, that was my baby. Yes, I did work on that. Not initially, but started Art and Science of Wine with James Halliday and Hugh Johnson was my first book with Hugh. It was so good to meet him. And James, of course, was a very large Australian character. And they're great to work with. And then I did move on to the Pocket Wine Guide, which was, that was great. That was a whole world of wine, and talking to specialists in each region that the book covered was an amazing experience for me. And obviously I had to sort of note down the detail, but I ended up ghostwriting it for Hugh, although the words were there, but I would kind of update it every year. And we had about nearly 20 different co-editions, so it was translated into many different languages. We had Macs in the very early days of Macs, but it wasn't like today where you could just sort of whiz everything off. You had to kind of, it was a tricky process to get that book out.
I can imagine. From there, you landed a dream job as editor at Decanter. What kind of timescales are we talking here between your early involvement in the world of publishing and then?
So I did about 5 or 6 editions of the Pocket Wine Book, and then I went to mid-90s. I went to Decanter. I kind of was ready for a change, but my now husband was out in California doing a prosthodontic postdoc qualification in California. So I decided to go out and work in California. That's what I was going to do. So I went out for 3 weeks and visited and looked for a job out there, flew back home. And then I got a call from Sarah Kemp at Decanter just out of the blue saying, do you want to come and work for us? And I said, well, I don't really, because I want to go to California. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll do it for 6 months. So, the rest is history. I joined Decanter and actually ended up flying out to California rather a lot, and it worked very well. Decanter was just an amazing place to work. It was just, to turn up there and see that, my byline could be, I could write a report on a tasting or something, and there would be my name in the magazine. It was just like such a joy. I loved it. Because with books, you're very much in the background. But
I'm guessing that the kind of office culture as well, that perhaps isn't quite so much the case today with remote working and smart working and people dispersed all over the world. Yeah. In those days, there would have been an office and a...
Yeah, you had to be there 5 days a week, definitely, if not more. None of the part-time working. It was, but that was great, because if you ever had a question or a joke to tell, you could just sort of run things through everybody, and it was I loved that, actually. It was a great experience. So you'd have the ad team next door, with their constant demands on us, and then we'd have a bunch of us editors and designers putting the whole thing together. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And what about some of your most memorable or favourite assignments from that period? But where did that role take you?
All sorts of places. One of my favourite places to research Amarone della Valpolicella.
Wow.
Maybe nearly 20 producers over a few days. It was exhausting, but the smell of those grape lofts and detail of the winemaking, I love that, and writing that up was fun.
Yeah. What kind of reception do you get as an editor or a writer of Decanter?
Absolutely brilliant. I got thoroughly spoiled. Yeah. A lot of lunches, and every producer would want to give you a lunch, and then you go to another one and they'd want to give you dinner. So it will be a lot of meals and gorgeous wines, and I can't knock it, really. It was a lovely lifestyle. Australia was good too. I think one of my highlights was the Adelaide Hills, and Stephanie Toole and Geoffrey Grosset and Stephen Henschke tasting their Rieslings and Shirazes. That was a real highlight, because I think Aussies are really willing to share the detail of their winemaking, and I love that. Okay.
And from Decanter, what next? You were involved in the Which Guide to Wine?
Yes.
Regular magazine and columnist contributor. Tell us about that.
That was good. I had a column for the Wine News in the States. That was a regular thing. And the Which Guide to Wine was a little bit like Pocket Wine, I suppose. You had to give an overview on what was happening in the world of wine that year, country by country. So that was fun to be in touch with everybody. And then we do a review of all the merchants, all the UK wine merchants, which was... Yeah, that was hard work, but it really put you in the know of what wines were where. And, I liked that. I enjoyed that very much. I mean, then my writing sort of changed track a bit, because although I still wrote and I still have the column for Wine News, I'd started doing some more copywriting, I suppose. So Marks and Spencer's, I think, was just later than most. It was launching its website. So I did a lot of copy for their wines online. And that was it was good because it was more of a regular sort of income, which was useful. But it also was a completely different style of writing, which I kind of didn't know it then, but it stood me in good stead sort of later. But it was, you'd have a box that you needed to write sort of 45 words, and then another quite wider description, 120 words, or very strict character prescription. So it was all sort of computerized, and they'd send me boxes of wine and I'd taste them and then sort of write these notes for their labels and for their shelf descriptions and for their brochures.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a lot of that with Marks and Spencers and Laithwaites. And they tend to be really classic examples. Each wine's a very classic examples of its kind. And M&S, Marks and Spencer's team, are quite a lot of input into how those wines are made as well. They want them to be sort of stereotypical, Chablis.
Yeah, absolutely. And then fast forwarding to more recent times, you are now a writer and editorial director for the Académie du Vin Library. That's a role you took up in 2019. What does that involve?
I was there at the start of that. That was what's so lovely. I just had a phone call from actually my old boss at Mitchell Beazley saying, we're just starting up a new project. Would you like to work with Hugh again and Steven Spurrier? And so I said, yes, of course, but thinking it was just like one article for a newspaper or something. But it wasn't. It was to be a new little company. And it was beyond exciting, I have to say, after sort of, working from home for quite a bit. It was just lovely to be involved in publishing again in such a, in the minutiae of it. I was responsible for all the editorials. So everything from, the design of the cover to the marketing blurb to the picture captions and the design of the footnotes, all of it. And, I think that's where I kind of experience it in book publishing. Obviously I had that, and magazine work, that was useful because I had to write quite a bit. And then the copywriting also, because I had to do a lot of marketing for the books that we were producing. But we started very slowly, and we had a book by Michael Broadbent and then another by Fiona Morrison. And yeah, it was just me on the editorial. We had just one designer, and I think there were about 8 of us in total. Just a very small company, just wine books. I think that the premise of it was stemming from a lunch with Hugh Johnson and Steven Spurrier and Ben Hawkins. They had a lunch where they were worried about the loss of all the lovely old wine writing. And I don't mean really ancient wine writing, although that too. A book is published and then 2 years later people forget about it. And it's just, how do you keep all those wonderful words alive? And so they had an idea to set this new company up, and weren't sure how to do it, just to keep those original authors, not just Hugh's work, Michael's work, Maurice Healy, some of the older sort of authors that they'd learned from when they were learning about wine. They were real wordsmiths, and so they just were sad to lose them. So that was what the Académie du Vin Library was all about. And then had the idea of doing an anthology series whereby we would use the words of the older authors and combine them with new work too. So that was really exciting. Sorry, is that answering your question?
Absolutely, yeah. That brings us to On Tuscany, which is one of those anthologies, part of a series of anthologies that the Académie du Vin Library produces. I do love the books that you produce. They're the most lavish, high quality, beautifully designed and illustrated books imaginable, but also a real depth and quality to the content as well. So yeah, I'm a really big fan of what you're doing there.
Thank you.
So tell us about this series then, on Tuscany, which we'll come on to and speak about in more detail, but what other regions form part of that series?
We started with Bordeaux. That was a sort of experimental one, really, but it seemed to really work. People liked it. And then we moved on to California, and that had such a warm reception in the States and everywhere. I think we realised we were onto something then. And then we had Champagne, and then Burgundy, and now Tuscany.
Do they follow more or less the same format?
They do. I mean, it doesn't have to be exact, but I think what I was doing is I wanted to make them something that I, as my younger self, would have liked to read. In my 20s, I always thought I was too busy to read a book, and I just wanted to know everything, know the best bits. And I don't think like that now, but I think at the time when you're younger, you just want everything all at once. And so I thought it would be a good idea to introduce, for younger people in the wine, coming into an interest in wine, introduce them to one of these regions by using these excerpts from favourite writers and specialists and experts, and pulling them together to make the whole story of the region. And I love doing that. But it obviously ended up that in putting the jigsaw together, there were gaps. So then I would commission a new piece from an author, and if I'd say to them, we've got Hugh Johnson and authors, and they would say, oh yes, I'd love to join those. And so we'd ended up getting some really kind of hot new authors to contribute to the books too, and that made them much more edgy, and so they developed from being just introductory books to actually sort of quite a bit of entertainment for people who knew the region and the wine already. So they served lots of purposes, I think.
Yeah.
But so the same format-ish, but the chapters and the sections really vary depending on what the quirks of the region, I suppose.
I have to say, I do love that concept of standalone articles which you can read independently, or you can just dip in and out of this book. And I think particularly in this age of limited concentration spans, I know, speaking personally, I sometimes find it difficult to spend half an hour, let alone any longer, with a book. There's so many other demands on time and concentration, that having these short standalone articles where you can just dip in and out is a really nice idea.
Yes, I think so. Well, it's a joy to produce them, I have to say. I really enjoyed it, and I'm just glad it works. It does seem to.
Yeah. What's next? Do you have another region in mind, or?
I'd love to do the Rhone, and I'd love to do Australia, probably because I've got some great excerpts from Len Evans and some of their quite wacky winemakers out there. I think we're probably going to do On Whiskey. That might well be the next one. So that's not wine, it's branching out a bit, but again, there's a lot of really good writing out there already to draw from. I think that's the starting point, and obviously good wine writers to commission new things from.
On Whiskey, as a Scot, I've definitely got a lot of time for.
Great.
This might be a good point to take a first reading from the book. The one that you've selected is a chapter entitled The Wild Winds, or at least an extract from that chapter by Curzio Malaparte. That, I think, gives us a really good sense of place, a really good introduction to Tuscany.
Every country has its wind. Every land is distinguished by the way it breathes. And the breath that sweeps the leaves from the olive trees, swells the top of the pines, smooths the stones of the walls and the facades of the houses, causes the hair to fly over the foreheads of the girls, and cleans the sky in the turbulent March days, is a sigh of the earth itself, its profound respiration. Also, Tuscany has its way of breathing, rather different from that of Liguria, Emilia, Romagna, Umbria, and Lazio, her neighbours. But to say different is not to say all. One ought to say contrary. It breathes in the same manner as the inhabitants, as the stones, the plants, the rivers, and the sea. 4 other winds, also in Tuscany, the cardinal winds, that is. They're called the Grecale, northeast, the Libeccio, southwest, the Scirocco, southeast, and the Tramontana, north. But these aren't the winds that gave Tuscany its character, its colour, its breadth, nor the winds that give the tone to the skin, the earth, the eyes, the leaves. There is our wind, which is Tuscan from head to toe. It is a wind, you see, that we have made ourselves with our own hands, to our own measurements, and a homemade wind like the peasant's bread. If it does curlicues and stumbles, it's more out of spite than to be agreeable. Usually it flows smoothly, unadorned with fancy figures, and if at times it swells and rises, it does so in order to caress the dome of the Brunelleschi, never to harmonise with the voices of the Grand Dukes or the academicians of the Crusca, or with those who play the rube or the fop in attempt to be a Tuscan. To breathe this wind is not easy. You have to be born a Tuscan. If not, it chokes you, knots your guts, or, what is worse, swells your jowls, which with us is held to be an ugly sight indeed. This wind has a bitter taste. It's like our olive oil, our true Chianti, like the fish in the Arno, like wit, irony, and laughter, easy urbanity of the Tuscans, who are witty, ironic, smiling, correct in manner and in word, but at bottom, how bitter.
Excellent. That's a really evocative introduction to Tuscany, using the winds, I suppose, as a gateway into the region itself.
Yes, I like the way it he's trying to sort of tap into what makes the people what they are, and the land, the way the winds sort of swirl around the land differently. And I think all of that affects wine and the vines, and too. I think it's a good place to start and set the atmosphere of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's drill straight down into Chianti, which I guess we all associate, or we all think of when we think of Tuscan wine. And Chianti will forever be associated with those pot-bellied fiascos in straw jackets, what Burton Anderson in the book describes as the epitome of rustic elegance. In Verona, you can still find those fiascos of Chianti in the supermarket shelves. What is it that makes it such a resonant and evocative region and wine?
I think maybe it's just the speed at which it's all happened for Chianti. In 70 years, it's changed so much. you can see its trajectory. Perhaps that's what it is that's fascinating. Until World War II, it was basically Chianti was basically a feudally run place. Each grower had to give 40% of their production to the owner of their estate. There was no incentive to develop and improve. And before that, Phylloxera had dumbed down the range of grapes they could use because not all of the native varieties responded well to the new rootstocks from America. After the war, obviously the workforce was depleted too, so all that was left was to churn out sort of high volumes to satisfy people's demand for wine. But basically, it was a really low time, and they even thought of turning the hillsides around to sheep. And a commission went out to sort of see how many flocks of sheep it would need to sort of make Chianti viable again. But since then, everything has just taken off, and maybe it's that fascinates the highs and lows along the way. As the mass production happened, and the wines got bitter, and they weren't great to taste, and then came the advent of the international varieties that spiced things up and made wines more interesting. There's the super Tuscans, and this is all in the book. And Hugh Johnson describes it, and Carla Capalbo and David Gleave. David Gleave talks about Luigi Veronelli, who was, a great ambassador for change in Chianti, and he said, don't stray from your core values to the Tuscan farmers, but of course they did. No, I think the fascination is with the glitz and glamour of the super Tuscans when they began to arrive. So there's so many fascinating things, really. It's a fascinating, beautiful landscape too, of course, that people really want to visit.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your personal relationship with that region? Is it a place that you enjoy visiting? Is it a wine that you enjoy drinking? What's your personal connection with the region?
Yeah, I think I do love the wines. I love the bitterness, the food matchability, and I think it all started for me. In 2003, we went out there to visit. We stayed in Greve, just outside Greve, and just had to scramble down a hillside, a little footpath into the piazza where we could drink Chianti. And we didn't think we could go into the restaurants because we had a 9-month-old baby at the time, and so we kind of very tentatively one day peered round a door and said, "Do you mind if we come in?" And of course, which was ridiculous because we were welcomed with open arms, and give us the baby and we'll look after him. You must eat, you must drink, you must. And so everywhere was like that. Everybody was so warm, and that was my initiation into Chianti to start with. And so yes, I've loved it since then.
Okay, so I know as a researcher and a wine communicator that a lot of the work I do is now online because it's quick and convenient to do so. But a book like On Tuscany is curated and authoritative and beautifully written, unlike obviously a lot of material on the internet. But as a traditional publisher, how do you compete with the internet, or what added value does a book like On Tuscany offer its readers?
I think it has the solidity of the expert voice that you can really trust. They're tried and tested voices that have researched over the years, and so there's that. It doesn't have the immediacy of the internet, but it does have the authority. It really does. I mean, I've used authors that really know and have visited the region many, many times, and have tasted the wines so many times. So I think that's what gives the books the edge. And then they're beautiful too, and they're permanent. So you have them, and as you were saying, you can dip into them as and when you want to sort of remind yourself of the information that's there.
I mean, the other thing that strikes me and that I often encounter on the internet is if I'm looking at a particular region or wine or producer, and you find exactly the same words in 5 or 6 or 7 different sources. So they've obviously I don't know whether Wikipedia is the master source. So it's difficult sometimes to find something original or fresh or provocative even, whereas I think a book like On Tuscany really does give you that originality.
Yes, it definitely does. No, you're absolutely right to spot that. I think having the voices, the different layers of voices, is such an important part of the book. Obviously they're all beautiful writers as well, so it's easy to read, and different, and some are quite poetic, some quite scientific, but all have an edge, and they have their viewpoints and opinions, which is really important, I think.
Yeah.
And it's quite a luxury to have them all in one place, isn't it? Really, rather than having
Just to give the listeners a sense, I mean, you've got people like D.H. Lawrence, You've got a 17th century poem by Francesco Reddi, and then you've also got articles by the most recently appointed Italian masters of wine. So there's a real depth and breadth. How do you select these writers or articles? What's the process involved?
Voyage of discovery. I mean, I start with, I suppose I'm guilty of starting with my favourites, and when then I'll fall in love with a piece that I've maybe seen on the World of Fine Wine or in Decanter, and then it's a question of going down rabbit holes. If you read carefully, you often find an allusion to a piece of poetry or another writer, and it's following that up. And they may not be appropriate for the book; they may be sort of too long-winded, but they may give another reference. And so it's a question of following rabbit holes and diving down and just falling in love with a new piece of writing, and then picking up the phone or writing an email to say, can we use it? Can I use an excerpt? And mostly people say yes. I mean, I think that as people get to know these books, as the authors get to know these books, they're really glad to be asked. And then they don't have to do any work because I'm just asking if I can use a chapter that they'd already written.
For them, is it the prestige of being associated with the book? Is it, if this isn't too direct a question, is there a financial?
Yes, there is. Not a huge amount if it's been published already, but there's definitely a financial reward and definitely a copy of the book and discount on further ones. And so it seems to be worth their while. I mean, people seem to like being alongside each other. They like having their names alongside the experts in the field, and it's really great for new writers as well, new MWs, new specialists of the region who kind of are just sort of trying to find their way, but know that they love a region. And if I ask them to write, it's just like an opportunity to sort of say to the world, here I am. And so take them seriously. So that's lovely as well to find new voices.
Yeah. So aside from this rich cast of writers, for me, the protagonist of the story is the Sangiovese grape.
Oh, yes.
And that's a relationship, I suppose, that's constantly evolving, the relationship between Sangiovese and Tuscany. What is it about that relationship that's so interesting or so compelling?
I mean, they belong to each other, don't they? I mean, Sangiovese doesn't really grow anywhere else. It does grow other places, and I don't know that it grows so perfectly anywhere else as in Tuscany. So they sort of rely on each other. And obviously Tuscany has ventured out with international grapes, and it has a whole wealth of its own indigenous grapes too. But Sangiovese is the one that they belong together. But, with the different clones, as I was saying, after phylloxera and after the war, meant that it's sort of fallen out of love with Sangiovese, and it's the highs and lows, I think, that are make it so interesting. And then of course
it's like Chianti, it's the highs and lows that make it so interesting. It's why I enjoy following Hellas Verona, who are the local football team, because it's so every year's a drama. There's ups and downs and highs and lows, but that from a storytelling point of view is what makes it so compelling.
Absolutely, yes. And it's a really great place now. It's so exciting because it's really coming back to the fore, isn't it? I mean, they're finding some really great clones to work with, and people are realizing that you don't need to blend in Cabernet and Merlot. Not that that's not great, it is, but that Sangiovese actually can be truly wonderful on its own.
Yeah.
And that's coming back as a strong message, isn't it? So yeah, part of the excitement.
Yeah, absolutely. Sangiovese in purezza is something that I quite often try and splash into, just to give you that real authentic and undiluted sense of Tuscany.
Yes. And I think that's why in the book you mentioned the two MWs, that Italy's first MW, I think, was Gabriele Garelli and Andrea Lonardi. They explore Sangiovese in Brunello country, and they are runners and mountain bikers and trail runners. They know every inch of the countryside of Brunello, as well as having grown up there, I think, in Gabrielle's case. And also they studied MW together, and they are promoting new regions within Brunello di Montalcino. And so because Sangiovese is the only grapes of soil grape there in those wines, it's going to be so interesting to see how it responds to the terroir and to how these new regions work. Yeah, another view of Sangiovese.
Yeah, absolutely. Another protagonist of the Tuscan wine story is, of course, Piero Antinori. So can you tell us what was his contribution to the development of Tuscan wines?
I think maybe if I give you a quote from the book from Hugh Johnson.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Tuscany and its Wines, 2000 and 2000. He says, Florence, 1904. The Marchese Pier Antinori leaves his palace in the city centre, with vast blocks of rusticated stone blackened by time and soot, to drive to Santa Cristina. The other side of the Arno, as he clatters up the road towards the monastery of the Certosa, the sun comes out from behind the grey storm clouds. The bare poplars shine like bundles of bronze rods. Mimosa sends wafts of honey across the road. Antinori is putting a plan into action. The Chianti he and his friends make on their estates is absurdly rough and ready. It was good in the past, even exported in bottles to England under the name of Florence. It was a puzzle why French theories for improvement did not work in Tuscany. At Broglio Castle, Bettino Ricasoli certainly made improvements after he was Prime Minister, using a blend of red and white grapes. But on this cold soil of the Chianti Hills, the main grape, the Sangiovese, is just too astringent. In most years, you have to alleviate its bite as best you can. The result is not exactly exquisite. The Marchese has a case of Lafite with him, Chateau Lafite. He has the means, he has the land, he has a warmer climate than Bordeaux. Why can't he make claret at Villa Antinori? The first thing is to try a blend, see what happens if he mixes his Villa Antinori with Lafite. He calls the cellar master and they blend, they taste. The cellar master makes a face. Antinori thinks this is a vast improvement. Bordeaux grapes are definitely the way to go. We know the outcome of this story. 100 years later, some of the Tuscany's greatest wines are Cabernets and Merlots.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, he was a revolutionary, despite his noble background, highly educated, urbane, and respectable. He really revolutionized the Tuscan approach to wine. His idea being that if you lace your Chianti with Cabernet and bottle it in a Bordeaux bottle, you have something really special. But that was a completely revolutionary concept at the time, and contrary to the production regulations that governed Chianti. So quite a bold and brave decision.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely frowned upon by some, but seemed to be the way to go, didn't it?
Yeah, and really paved the way for a new wave of wine that would subsequently become known as Super Tuscans, that took the ingredients of Tuscan wine, the Sangiovese, but then introduced French grapes to create new and exciting wines. There was his cousin Mario Incisa della Rocchetta, who released the first vintage of Sassicaia in 1972. It was another landmark moment in the history of Tuscan wine. Tignanello as well. So yeah, there were these highly educated, noble families who, by ignoring the rules, turned into unlikely revolutionaries.
They did, and it was a strange time for them to be doing that almost as well, because it was the same time as the DOC laws were being laid down in the 60s, early 60s and through then. So they were rebelling just as they started to be constrained. So very brave and bold. So the country was going in, the wines were going in many different directions, weren't they?
Yeah. And then some, at the same time, Le Pergole Torti being an example, were breaching the rules, but by insisting on 100% Sangiovese. So at the same time as you have these blends, you also have other new products that are heading in the opposite direction. And I guess it's that makes the Tuscan wine region such an interesting region to study in the way that you have with this book.
Absolutely, yes. And I think David Gleave introduces Giulio Gambelli, who was a winemaker that worked with Sergio Manetti, who stuck up for Sangiovese at that time, saying, this is the grape we want to work with. And they were both quite stubborn about it. We're not going to go the Cabernet Sauvignon route. We're not going to plant Merlot. Yeah, so we kind of delve into these wonderful characters with David, and with Susan Hume also. She talks about the rebel winemakers who made these wines.
Yeah.
They're all fascinating.
And then, as you mentioned as well, there's the Brunello di Montalcino and the wines of Montepulciano as well. So within that area of Tuscany, you do have these little provinces as well, if you like, that are doing interesting things with wine, but are also such beautiful places to visit and experience in the way that those masters of wine that you mentioned. You can run, you can walk, you can cycle. You can really get on the ground here, if you like.
Yes, it's really exciting, isn't it? So it just makes me want to get out there right now.
Yeah. Okay. What about white wine? I mean, we generally associate Tuscany with red wines. I think, if I remember correctly from the book, account for about 90% of Tuscan wine production. But what about white wines? With climate change and evolving consumer habits, Can we expect to see a greater emphasis on white wine production?
Definitely, I think so. I think they've always been there, and as Emily O'Hare explains, she's one of our new writers in this book. She's a sommelier, but she's turned to writer. She lives out in Italy now, and she's written a lovely piece about it's involving white wines and pirates and treasure and wizards. It's absolutely brilliant. And she points out that Pre-Phylloxera Moscadello was the grape of the rich and famous in Tuscany, but then it was sort of usurped by Trebbiano after Phylloxera couldn't sustain the American rootstocks, and Trebbiano took over, producing rather dreadful wines. But so it kind of rather spoilt the white wine situation. Yeah, that now, I think they're really returning to some of their fantastic sort of native varieties like Ansonica, which is particularly strong in the island. My Italian pronunciation is terrible. The island of Giglio, how do you pronounce that? But anyway, it's this grape is absolutely, it's full flavour with pine and cinnamon aromas. It's gorgeous, but it's supposed to have come from Greece because the pirate Barbarossa, she says, sent all the inhabitants of the island back to Constantinople as slaves and replaced them with Greek population who brought their vines with them. And so we have Ansonica, so there's that one. But then you have Vernaccia, which is much more native. I've got a quote for that one from Emily's piece. And Vermentino also, it comes from the Maremma. In the Maremma, it's very sun-warmed and warm, whereas further north, it's much more fresh and briny from the Massa Carrara, which is where the marble quarries are. And you might have seen them in the film The Brutalist recently.
Yeah.
400 metres above sea level. Also, the wines are much fresher, as I say. So Vermentino is very interesting, Vernaccia and Sonica. Definitely worth watching out for the whites, as well as dry whites, not just in the Van Santos.
The article by Emily O'Hare is one that I really enjoyed as well. Do you want to give us an extract from that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really lovely. She calls it hidden in plain sight because they're all out there. No talk, all towers. If Michelangelo was willing to swap 8 shirts for the Trebbiano, I wonder what or how many items of clothing he would have parted with for some flagons of Vernaccia di San Gimignano, given that the wine was thought to have, and perhaps still has, aphrodisiac qualities. In 1643, his grandnephew, Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, a Florentine poet and mathematician, wrote of one of the best tasting notes of all on the white wine made from the variety of Vernaccia di San Gimignano. It licks, it kisses, it bites, it pricks, it stings. I love how relevant and how relatable this note is, and the intimacy it imparts because of the experience of drinking Vernaccia is always tactile and most appreciated on the palate. There are no powerful aromatics to speak of. The fragrance is soft and undemonstrative, akin to smelling an oyster, maybe with a hint of golden delicious apple and sweet fig leaf that set a semi-nude biblical scene about to get saucy. But the palate is fabulous, fun, lip-smacking, thirst-quenching, sapid, tannic, acidic, salty, with all the elements that the tongue can relish. But like Trebbiano, Scano, sadly, not all Vernaccia di San Gimignano enhances amore. Burton Anderson warns in his still unbeatable Wine Atlas of Italy, 1992, that while a few producers strive for real class, the general trend is to expand vineyards and raise yields to capitalise on a marketable name. Much of the wine is sold to tourists who flock to the town with the medieval skyscrapers. So obviously that's not true anymore because it's taken much more seriously than it was in 1992, but there was a time when it was for the tourists.
Yeah. And one of the things I liked, another one of the things I liked about this book was the way that you are referencing and including these historic writers, I suppose we could now call them. It's 1992, but people like Burton Anderson, who were hugely influential, Nicholas Belfrage as well. In my daily life as a wine communicator, I wouldn't really come across their names now, but it's great to have a book like this which reintroduces to new generations their work.
Yes, I think it's the whole point. It's a large part of the whole point. Nick Belfrage is hugely important, and he's one of the best and first Italian wine communicators. It was so important to have his voice in the book, and I was delighted when his family said that they gave us permission to use his words. And and Burton Anderson too was really enthusiastic to join. So they're so clever with words, these writers. It's just and so careful. They're Andrew Jefford. They're brilliant, and we can't lose sight of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the way the book it focuses obviously on the big protagonists. We've already mentioned the Super Tuscans, the Sangioveses, but then there is also space for lesser known varieties and emerging regions. I particularly enjoyed the monogram on Canaiolo by James Lawrence, posing the question whether we're about to rediscover this underrated gem. Are there areas that are currently exciting you, or what's your view on what's going to be the next big thing to come out of Tuscany?
Oh gosh! Well, I mean, as I say, I'm really excited by the discoveries that Gabriele and Andrea Lonardi are making. New terroirs, and sort of that ties into the UGAs, to the next big thing in Chianti. I think really, the demarcated regions that are really bringing the Classico region back to the fore and making us really think about the terroirs and the different flavors that we can get from different parts of the landscape. I think they're really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are, again, articles in the book that cover the UGA's additional geographical units, which it sounds like something my kids would study at middle school maths class. But I just wish they could have come up with a more evocative or pleasing name for the additional geographical units. It's so dry and
it's really not very inspiring, is it?
Not particularly elegant, but an important development nonetheless in the constantly evolving world of Tuscan wine.
Definitely, I think Sarah Marsh. We need more writers like her to sort of sum up the character of the wines, and so that hopefully the names supersede the awful nomenclature they've been given.
Yeah, absolutely. There needs to be a rebranding. I think at some point, even the acronym UGAs is not particularly elegant either. So yeah, I think we could do a little bit of consultancy perhaps on how they might want to rebrand that. I was thinking even this morning about the consortia, not particularly relating to Tuscany, but more generally, some of the consortia names are ridiculous as well, extremely long, and trying to include every single sub-region in the area, and with very, very difficult pronunciations for an international audience. And I wondered also if there was a moment to rebrand some of these consortia. But again, I guess that's a heavily political task that should really be undertaken lightly.
Yes, it gets tricky, doesn't it? And the Italians, they don't take change lightly.
No, but what came to mind was I remember in the UK context, the tourist board used to be called the English and Welsh Tourist Board, or the Scottish Tourist Board, which was a terrible mouthful as well. And they subsequently changed to Visit Scotland or Visit England, which is much more, as a brand name, much more compelling.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, a little hobby horse of mine at the moment. Let's turn to your writing or your editing habits. You've got a long experience as a writer and editor, bringing together big projects, articles that you're writing yourself. So how do you get in the mood to write? What are your writing habits? How do you fit around family life?
I wish it could be interesting and say that I was like that wonderful writer. Is it Adaf Swift? I can't remember. Who listens to heavy rock when she's writing, and on a repeat, it can be the same song over and over again, but loud. And I can't do that. I have to have walked the dogs, fed the sheep, tucked the chickens up, and everything has to be calm. And I have to be have my cup of tea in the morning. Morning's the best for me. I focus much better. And the afternoons are for creative bits, for writing and for rabbit holes and research. So yeah, writing and editing in the morning. It's quiet.
Okay. And what about advice for aspiring wine writers, as an editor and as someone who's involved in compiling these compendiums? What advice would you give to aspiring wine writers who want to get involved in that kind of work?
Be well researched and accurate, and care about your commas and keeping my attention. Careful sentence structure. All of that it's boring, but if you can hold people's attention if you keep the English correct, worth keeping an eye on the detail. Yeah. But definitely get out there and talk to people. Talking to people, don't just stay at home and read. Just get out and taste wine and talk to other writers.
Okay, yeah, good advice. What about reading for pleasure? What's on your bedside table? Do you have time for reading for pleasure between your chickens and your rabbits?
Not too much, but I do like to have Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst, and I have Caledonia Road by Andrew O'Hagan at the moment.
Yeah, Andrew O'Hagan, I'm trying to remember the last book I read of his was Fireflies. Was he Fireflies?
I don't know, this is the first I've read of his, and I like it a lot. I think it's taking some unusual scenarios and different places, showing the damaging power of the internet. It's quite scary at some point. I haven't finished yet, so I don't know what happens, but it is quite alarming.
Mayflies, not Fireflies. Yeah, Mayflies. Yeah, Mayflies is a fantastic book that I read, I think, earlier this year, and it basically revolves around a group of friends in the summer of 1986, and they grew up in a small Scottish town and had this kind of hedonistic lifestyle, as I suppose teenagers from small Scottish towns were wont to do at that point, and they gravitated towards Manchester, where there was an evolving music scene. The way the book is structured, it's structured in two parts. So you have this part where they're growing up together and having this incredible hedonistic experience, and then there's a massive leap forward as they're in later life with families and some of the traumas and tribulations of adult life. I won't go into any detail to avoid spoiling it, but I thought it was a really, really fantastic read.
I'll make that my next one.
Okay, good. And what about your future plans? What can we expect from you, or what can we expect next from the Académie du Vin Library?
So I'm working on a really lovely book with a professor of geology from Aberystwyth University, Alex Maltman. It's called Taste the Limestone, Smell the Slate. And it's fantastic. He's a geologist, and he's not the sort of writer we'd expect perhaps with our wine series, but he's passionate about wine and has been for years. But he's worried about the link between geology and the wine in our glass. And, does wine really smell of limestone, taste of slate? And this is his delve into each rock and each landscape, and it's absolutely fascinating. He's just unusual, I think, for an academic, in that he communicates so beautifully. Yeah. I think he's wasted on just being in the university, so we need to give him more airtime, and that's what we're doing.
That sounds fantastic, and shades of our very own Professor Atillio Scienza, who, although he's not a geologist, he's certainly a scientist who writes evocatively about wine from a scientific perspective. In fact, I'm currently editing one of his books, and this question of minerality is one that he is grappling with, and whether that has any basis in science.
Wow. That sounds like they need to compare notes, because they're both thinking along the same lines. Is it really possible that it's minerals?
Yeah, it sounds like they're covering some similar ground there. You can certainly compare notes on that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So On Tuscany is available now. It's available on the Académie du Vin Library website. Where else can our listeners find that if they're in a international context? Where can we get a copy of On Tuscany and the other books from the Académie du Vin Library?
I mean, the website is still the best place, I think, and we do sell it lots in America and every English-speaking country. But we do have copies in France in the big bookshops as well. So but I think the website is definitely the best place to start.
And what about social media? Where can we follow you?
Yes, definitely. Me personally, I'm not really very good at social media, but the Académie du Vin Library website is where to kind of keep up with us. And we do have Twitter and Instagram as well, that the others on my team are really active on. So definitely keep an eye on our books on those places, and for all the wines that we're drinking as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for being my guest today, Susan, on Book Club. On Tuscany, from Brunello to Bulgaria, Wine Tales from the Heart of Italy. Highly recommended if you want to take a deep dive into one of Italy's most famous and evocative wine regions. Really is a fantastic book. Thanks once again for your company today, Susan, and thanks for listening. Until next time, ciao. Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods.